Hello, Stoke Damerel. We're going to have a look at a story this week called The Hobbit, which was written by J R R Tolkien just under 100 years ago. And we've got two learning intentions. The first one is to describe a character, and our second learning intention is to write complex sentences, including subordinate clauses. You may have come across subordinate clauses before or know them under a different name, but I'll explain what they are again for you, and we're going to practice writing some of those sentences today. And I've got some other activities for you to try as well. J R R Tolkien was born just over 100 years ago, and he published The Hobbit in 1937. He fought in the First World War, and after he was discharged from the army, he got a job as a professor of languages at Oxford University. And he used his knowledge of languages to create his own languages for use in The Hobbit. And it's one of the very first fantasy stories. It talks about hobbits and elves and goblins and orcs, dragons. And it's a quest story. It tells the story of Bilbo Baggins' quest to be a burglar and try and go and steal from the dragon Smaug in the Misty Mountains. It's quite a long book, and I'm going to read you a shortened version of it today. So it's The Hobbit by J R R Tolkien, but it's my version of it. And we're going to have a look at a story map to start with. You might want to pause the video at some points as we go along, maybe revisit it and have a look at the story again, because it will help you when you do some of your writing. The Hobbit by J R R Tolkien. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit called Bilbo Baggins. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the end of worms and an oozy smell. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Bilbo enjoyed a peaceful life. He was fond of fine food and drink and hated to be disturbed. So you can imagine his dismay when his peace was suddenly shattered by a wizard and 13 boisterous dwarves tumbling through his front door. After the dwarves had enjoyed poor Bilbo's hospitality, their leader, Thorin, began to explain. They were embarking on a great quest to reclaim their stolen treasure from the marauding dragon Smaug. Bilbo was to be their burglar and help to distract the dragon while the dwarves recovered the treasure. Bilbo listened in silence. "Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins," he muttered to himself. "Thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age." The dwarves were very sceptical about Gandalf's choice for a burglar, but Gandalf reassured them. "There's more to that little hobbit than meets the eye," he said, his eyes sparkling. That settled it. The party set out from the Green Dragon Inn, leading their ponies out of Hobbiton and across an ancient stone bridge. Bilbo, with a good deal of mumbling and grumbling, followed behind. Night fell, and the dwarves decided to make camp in some shadowy woods. As they settled down to rest, a sinister red light appeared in the darkness. Reluctantly, Bilbo was sent to investigate. "Trolls!" he whispered, cowering behind a tree. 3 hungry trolls!" Without warning, the trolls woke from their slumber and angrily began hauling the dwarves into large sacks to feast on later. What was worse, Gandalf had disappeared. Hours passed, and the trolls argued about how to share their spoils. Gandalf, hidden in the trees, tricked the trolls into remaining outside when the sun came up. The sunlight turned the nocturnal trolls to stone. Crossing the Misty Mountains in a violent snowstorm, the dwarves were imprisoned in a deep cavern by goblins. Gandalf led the dwarves to a passage out of the mountain, but Bilbo was accidentally left behind. Wandering through the tunnels, Bilbo found a strange golden ring lying on the ground. He took the ring and put it in his pocket. Soon he encountered Gollum, a hissing, whining creature who lived in a pool in the caverns and hunted fish. Gollum wanted to eat Bilbo, and the two had a contest of riddles to determine Bilbo's fate. "What have I got in my pocket?" asked Bilbo. "Thief!" thief, Baggins! We hates it! We hates it forever! Cried Gollum, who did not know the answer. Placing the magic ring on his finger, Bilbo disappeared and managed to escape from the treacherous Gollum. The dwarves, reunited with Bilbo and Gandalf, continued their journey, pensive and fearful. Let's have a look at the way the story works out. So it's by J R R Tolkien, but I've abridged it. That means I've cut it really short, so it's nice and short for us to have a look at. So in our first paragraph, we're introduced to Bilbo Baggins and where he lives. He doesn't live in a little hole. He's got a lovely, comfortable house, a hobbit hole. And I'm describing it here a little bit. He's fond of fine food and drink. He doesn't like being disturbed. And then suddenly, his quiet life is disturbed by a wizard and lots of dwarves, all inviting themselves into his house. Bilbo feeds the dwarves, he gives them food and drink, and after they've enjoyed his hospitality, their leader, who's called Thorin, who's the leader of the 13 dwarves, begins to explain. They're going on a quest to reclaim stolen treasure from a marauding dragon called Smaug. Now, Smaug attacks the dwarves and destroys their city, essentially, and steals all their gold. They want Bilbo to be their burglar. They want him to be quiet and discreet and go and try and distract the dragon while they recover all their treasure. He listens to them, and he doesn't really want to go. Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins, he mutters to himself. But the dwarves aren't even sure about Gandalf's choice either. Gandalf's the wizard, remember. They're not even sure about his choice for a burglar, but Gandalf reassures them. He thinks that Bilbo might be a good burglar, and he thinks he'll play an important part in the mission. They set out from a pub, the Green Dragon Inn in Hobbiton, and they cross an ancient stone bridge. And they travel all day and all night. And then when night falls, they make camp in some shadowy woods. And then we come across the trolls, the nasty, evil trolls who want to eat the hobbits and the dwarves, and they want to cook them up in a big pot. Bilbo spots the dwarves, and they wake up, and they begin hauling the dwarves into large sacks to have as a feast. Gandalf's disappeared. And then the hours pass, and the trolls argue about how to share out the dwarves amongst themselves. Gandalf is hidden in the trees, and he tricks the trolls into staying outside. He knows that when the sun comes up, it will turn the trolls into stone. There's a long journey ahead of them. They cross the misty mountains. There's a big snowstorm. And the dwarves are captured and imprisoned, put into prison in a deep cavern. That's a deep, very, very big cave in the mountains. They manage to escape, but Bilbo's left behind. And while he's left behind on his own, he comes across this strange gold ring. And if you know the Lord of the Rings at all, this is the very first story in that sort of sequence of stories. He finds the golden ring, and he has a competition with a horrible creature called Gollum, who lives in the caves. And they ask each other riddles. We'll have a look at those riddles in a little while and see if we can work out what they mean. Bilbo manages to get away because Gollum doesn't know the answer to one of Bilbo's riddles. And Bilbo places the magic ring on his finger, and the ring makes him disappear. And because he's disappeared, he manages to escape from Gollum. And then, all together, reunited again, the dwarves, Bilbo, and the wizard Gandalf carry on with their journey. Now, this is only really the first part of the story of The Hobbit. It's just one book, but it's quite a long book. And Peter Jackson, the director, made it into 3 separate films. And I've really covered the first film and the first part of the book in my shortened version of the story. Now, we're going to get the grammar part of our learning out of the way to start with. I've picked a sentence from the story. Wandering through the tunnels, Bilbo found a strange golden ring lying on the ground. Now, this sentence is a complex sentence. It's made up of 2 separate parts. A main clause, Bilbo found a strange golden ring lying on the ground, and a subordinate clause, wandering through the tunnels. Now, the subordinate clause is really adding some extra information to the sentence. The main clause tells us what's going on. Bilbo finds a strange golden ring lying on the ground. And that main clause, the bit in red, makes sense all by itself. So if you ignore the green bit, The red part of the sentence makes sense by itself. Bilbo finds a strange golden ring lying on the ground. Makes sense. The subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence here, wandering through the tunnels, doesn't really make sense by itself. It hasn't got a subject in it. So the subordinate clause really is the bit of the sentence which won't make sense on its own. And notice how I've used a comma to mark the subordinate clause in green from the main clause in red. I could switch that sentence around. Bilbo found a strange golden ring lying on the ground, wandering through the tunnels. It makes more sense with that subordinate clause at the beginning. And here's some more complex sentences taken from the story. After the dwarfs had enjoyed poor Bilbo's hospitality, their leader Thorin began to explain. The party set out from the Green Dragon Inn, leading their ponies out of Hobbiton and across an ancient stone bridge. And I'll let you have a read through the rest of them. Notice how the red part of the sentence is the main clause, and it makes sense by itself. The green part of the sentence is the subordinate clause, and it doesn't make sense by itself. So here, I've got a subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence. Here, I've got my subordinate clause at the end of the sentence. At the beginning. And here, my subordinate clause is in the middle of the sentence. And there's a special name for that kind of clause. It's called an embedded clause. It splits up the main clause in the sentence. And you can play around with these sentences a bit, and you can put them in a different order. A sinister red light appeared in the darkness as they settled down to rest would make sense as well. You could change the sentences around, change the order to make your own writing a little bit more interesting. If I go down a little bit here, have a look. Placing the magic ring on his finger doesn't make sense by itself. That's the subordinate clause. Bilbo disappeared and managed to escape from the treacherous Gollum. And here I've used another embedded clause. The dwarves, reunited with Bilbo and Gandalf, continued their journey pensive and fearful. Spend a little bit of time having a look at that. And I've made it quite easy for you because I've put all my subordinate clauses in green and all my main clauses in red to make it easy for you to spot them. But look at the different positions in the sentence and how I've changed them around to make my writing a little bit more interesting and at the same time added a little bit more detail. Now, it's time for you to have a little practice with this. I've put my subordinate clauses in green, my main clauses in red. And what I'd like you to do, these will be on the school website. I would like you to try and take a subordinate clause and a main clause and make them into a complex sentence. So you need to pick two clauses that go together. So let's have a look for one. How about encouraged by his response, comma, the Prime Minister called an election. So if you take your subordinate clauses and your main clauses from this page on the website, you can have a go at writing some complex sentences of your own. When we're writing complex sentences, here's some words that you might have seen this in the classroom or up on a wall somewhere in school. I saw a wabub, and that's just a reminder. It's a mnemonic to teach you how to use some of those words which help you to build complex sentences. So I've got if, since, as, when, although, while, after, before, until, and because. And you can see from those words in I saw a wabub that they're used to add extra information to a sentence. And as you use those words, you'll find you're starting to form your own complex sentences. Here's a little bit more practice for you. What I'd like you to do, if you can find some dice, or just a die, I would like you to roll the die 4 times to give yourself a sentence starter, a subject number 1, a subject number 2, and an adverb. Write those words down, so you might get a 2, despite, then a 3, spider, then a 1, dog, then a 5, interestingly. And I'd like you to write a sentence using your 4 words containing a main and subordinate clause. That might seem a bit complicated to start with, so I'll give you an example. Here's what I rolled. I rolled a 4, after. Then I rolled a 1, Mr. Simmons. Then I rolled a 3, swimming pool. Then I rolled a 6, disgustedly. And I've used those words to create a complex sentence. After falling in with a splash, Mr. Simmons disgustedly climbed out of the swimming pool. Then what I've done is I've rearranged it. Mr. Simmons disgustedly climbed out of the swimming pool after falling in with a big splash. Notice here that when I've used the subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence, I put a comma after it, but at the end of the sentence, I don't need to use the comma. And I've tried to be a bit clever, and I've also used an embedded clause. Mr. Simmons, after falling in with a big splash, disgustedly climbed out of the swimming pool. I apologise for my spelling mistake there. Have a go at the game. Try about 3 or 4 times and see if you can write 3 or 4 complex sentences using a subordinate clause and then a main clause. And I'll skip back so you can have another look at the game board. You might want to pause the video here while you have a go at that. Now then, as I told you, Bilbo and Gollum have a competition to see who can out-riddle the other one. So they ask, these are the riddles that appear in The Hobbit. Bilbo asks one, then Gollum asks one, then Bilbo asks one, and eventually Bilbo wins by asking Gollum what he's got in his pocket, and it's Gollum's ring that Bilbo has stolen. But these are the riddles that come before. Have a look at them, have a read through them, and see if you can work out what the answers are. Pause the video now. Read through, have a chat with your friends, have a chat with your grown-ups. See if you can work out the answer to these 5 riddles. And in just a moment, I will show you the answers. What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees, up, up it goes, and yet never grows. Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters. It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes out first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter. Alive without breath, as cold as death. Never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking. This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats mountain down. Make sure you pause the video if you want to have a guess at what the answer to the riddles are. And here they come. So here's your first independent task. Can you compose your own riddle? Think of a feeling, object, person or place. Then come up with some difficult clues to it. Try it out on a parent, a friend or your teacher. If you can make it rhyme like a poem, even better. The second independent task for this week is, can you describe a character from the story? I'd like you to try and make sure your description includes the character's personality and their likes and dislikes, as well as just describing what they might look like. I've put 4 examples on my presentation here. So I've got Bilbo, Gandalf the wizard, Thorin, remember he was the leader of the dwarves, and a goblin. So you can describe what they look like. If you've seen one of the films, you might have a few more ideas. It can be any character. You might want to describe the dragon Smaug, but try and think about what their character is like, as well as just describing what they look like. If you can include a subordinate clause or an embedded clause in your character description, even better. Here's my third independent task for this week. Go to the website that I've put the link up to here, www.brainpop.com, and there are lots of activities to do with J R R Tolkien. You can find out quite a lot more about him, and there's some games and other activities for you to try as well. Now, this is the big one. On their school website, you'll find a planning grid to plan your own fantasy story based on The Hobbit. So if you want to have a go at this one, you can look at my structure of the story of The Hobbit here, and I've put a little description of what happens in each part, and you can change parts of it. You could change the characters, you could change what happens to those characters, you could change what happens as they go out on their journey, you could change the baddies from being trolls and goblins to something else. It's entirely up to you. Have a go at writing the beginning of your own fantasy story. And as I said, that plan there for you to plan your story will be on the school website as well. And just for a bit of a break from all that writing, my fifth independent task is to draw a map of Bilbo's underground home. Use your imagination, draw a plan, like a bird's eye view of the different tunnels and rooms that might be underground in Bilbo's house. And I've shown you an example of how to draw a plan there. So that's just to give you a little bit of a break from all that writing. And of course, don't forget to ask your grown-ups if you can watch Peter Jackson's amazing films of The Hobbit. There's 3 films. They're quite long, but they're full of action. They're really, really exciting, and it will give you a much better understanding of the books as well. And if you want to have a look at the book of The Hobbit, it's quite a tricky book, but it's really good book to read, and it's kind of aimed at being read at about your age. So if you are a good reader and you'd like to try and read The Hobbit, see if you can get hold of a copy of it. I hope you enjoy this week's activities.